Reconciliation may not happen in this life, but the good news is that it will happen. It will be uncomfortable, but it will be true. It seems that the Lord wants to make certain that Ezekiel understands his responsibility in the letter this morning. He is being given the divine task of truth-telling, and there is simply no pleasant outcome for the prophets, for they either do their task and are killed by the people, or they don't and are judged by God. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. One such story in the history of the church involves the well-admired John Chrysostom, who's the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the name Chrysostom is actually a title that he bears. It means the golden tongue. Imagine being such a good preacher that you were forever memorialized as the golden tongued. But before he was revered, he was despised. St. Chrysostom was a priest in Antioch and would have been content there. But the bishop in Constantinople died, and John found himself thrust into the position much against his will. Even as a priest, John was known for his preaching, for his strictness in life, and his high demands for the rich. Can we begin to see why he might have been despised? He was immensely popular with the people and either hated or ignored by the wealthy. Some of his more famous sayings include, "Not to share our riches with the poor is to rob them," or "The rich are given for the help of the poor, and the poor are given for the salvation of the rich," or "If you cannot see Christ in the beggar at the church door, you will not find him in the chalice." His first year as the bishop, he cut the cost of the episcopal palace, removing all excess spending to such a degree that within a year he was able to fund the building of a major hospital, which at that time was still a very new idea. Eventually, this popularity and preaching enraged the bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. He held a synod in Egypt which held the task of deposing John. And so the synod voted to depose him, which John chose to simply ignore. However, the emperor at that time, who was also the head of the church, exiled John, not just because the bishop of Alexander had asked, but also because the emperor's wife, the Empress Eudoxia, hated the man. And so the people were in an uproar all throughout Constantinople over the arrest of their bishop. And the night of his arrest, there was an earthquake. All of this terrified Eudoxia, who was afraid of divine retribution for her actions. And so immediately John was called back, and his arrest was undone, and his exile was undone. Now, saint that he was, John seemed to lack any survival instinct whatsoever, because his peace did not last long. Within a year of him being reinstated, the empress had placed a silver statue of herself in front of the cathedral and had scheduled all these celebrations around the statue to such a degree that the church was not able to go about its daily services. So John complained to the magistrates in the city, and word reached Eudoxia that he was complaining about her. That wasn't quite enough for John, though. He began to preach in one of his sermons about Eudoxia. He said, "Again, Herodias raves. Again, she is troubled. She dances again and again desires to receive John's head in a charger," alluding to the wife of King Herod who had John the Baptist beheaded. He would have done well to remember Paul's words in Romans that the authority does not bear the sword in vain. At the Easter Vigil, in the year 404, as John was preparing to baptize the catechumens, the bishop's enemies brought with them an imperial red. Now, there is much we can learn from the story of John Chrysostom, but for today, I want to highlight just two things. One, being a saint has more to do with courage than piety. And courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of grace. Because the courageous have fears that cowards will never know. And two, like Ezekiel, like John, Jesus calls us to be a people of truth and truth-telling. That's why in Matthew's reading today, he gives us an outline for handling conflict. He does not think that the church will be without conflict. He expects it. Any number of people living in close proximity will develop conflict. But what separates the church from other groups is that we can face conflict, we can face mistakes, we can face sin without falling apart. Now, it is uncomfortable, to be sure, but Christ loves us enough to make us uncomfortable with a false peace. Christ loves us enough to show us a better way. Christ loves us enough, even to death on a cross, to be present among us. And where Christ is, there is true love to be found. And love frees us, but not without a cost. The cost of love is to take up our cross, to give up our false selves and discover our true selves, to abandon our fantasy and embrace the reality, to let go of our myths and to grab hold of the truth. Are you beginning to see what it might cost you? For John, it cost him everything, until ultimately it cost him his life. As a sidebar, if you believe there's nothing worth dying for, you will bear the unfortunate responsibility of dying for nothing. Because here's the thing to remember about the conflict of John and Eudoxia. Eudoxia died also. Now, I have to believe that John and Eudoxia ultimately will have been reconciled if they are to stand before Christ. And what is their conflict in the light of the resurrection? We're talking about it 1,500 years later, and I'm sure it seems bizarre. What must it seem like to Christ in his view from eternity? I don't mean to trivialize human conflict. It is serious. But remember this perspective when facing conflict yourself. The wounds you carry will be bound up. The wounds you cause will be bound up. Reconciliation may not happen in this life, but the good news is that it will happen. It will be uncomfortable, but it will be true. And we finally will know, even as we are fully known, the power of God to soften the human heart, to bind up the broken pieces of our lives into the wholeness and holiness of his perfect love.